Hi, everybody. Thank you. So it's so much fun to be here. Hi to everybody who's watching either live or possibly in a replay. My name is Rabbi Denise, and I am super excited to be doing this with Dan. So I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I serve an online community called Secular Synagogue. And it's certainly an interesting time to be doing digital Judaism via a community. And so we're, happy to talk to folks about how we've been doing it for the last year and a half since we started. Obviously, now we're in a moment when more and more people are looking to connect online. So I think that's part of what we'll talk about. But we decided to name this little show that Dan and I are doing Daring Judaism. And
That was your idea.
It was my idea.
So explain it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was partly a riff on Brene Brown and her work Daring Greatly, and also how she extends that into talking about daring communities and daring leadership. So we'll get into that more, I'm sure. But I think that the idea of daring Judaism for me is particularly exciting because what Dan and I share in common is that we both care a lot about Jewish community and communal spaces, both virtual and also cyber. I mean, virtual and also in person. But we find that some of the things that might happen in some of those more traditional spaces don't speak to us personally as Jews. And we're both interested in creating opportunities for people who might be alternative Jews or those connected to Jews to find spaces where they can derive meaning from Jewish culture, Jewish teachings, Jewish tradition, Jewish community, all of that. And so I think it requires just a little bit of daring to be able to say that we are inheritors of Jewish culture and tradition, and we want to be able to Jew it our way. And so that's sort of the premise of what we're going to be talking about every week here on Jewish Live.
Yeah, I'm really excited because I think another element where we share in common is that while we don't necessarily feel that some of the traditional ways of being Jewish, or actually what, to my mind, I would reframe that and say what's called the traditional ways of being Jewish. I mean, I think that I raised some doubts about how traditional a lot of things are that people think of as being traditional, and that was empowering to me to discover. But I think it's also that what you and I share in common, I think why I connect so much to you, and part of what's going to be on this show is that we both think that the ancient material of Judaism is still really valuable, and that we can mine it in a new way. And so one feature of our show, I think, is, if it works out right, is that we're going to talk about this week's Torah portion, but from a more secular perspective, which is work that you've done in a formal way, actually written about it, and work that I've done, to call it work would be in quotation marks, but in an informal way, or have a lot of interest in. And I don't know if how this lands on you, but the way that I think about it is that a lot of what is thought of as the traditional practices, or let's say the religious practices even, that I think of that as kind of the user interface to something that underlies the user interface, and the thing that underlies the user interface, I think, is actually quite profound and quite strong. And that's where we think about, I would call it human wisdom. And I think human wisdom is often expressed in storytelling. That's a way to teach. And so we have mythology. And I think, by the way, maybe something that we could talk about today too is where Jewish mythology helps us in our current situation, because I really think it does. And that it may be that, first of all, maybe the religious user interface is still working for a lot of people, and that's awesome. It's like the people who, they love Chrome. I'm an Apple user, but for those of us who are Apple users, right, it's really hard to use the Google user interface, and vice versa. And so the question is, a lot of people are triumphalist about computers too, and they say, oh, you're an idiot for liking Google, or you're crazy for liking Apple. It's so expensive and it's not worth it, and whatever, and I would say, no, they're both valid ways of accessing what the underlying thing is, which is computing, right? And so I'm excited to get into some of that depth of view. And I set that up as opposed to certain people who say, like, they almost kind of throw the whole thing away, and say, and again, there's nothing wrong with that either. It's just not my passion. And I think that you share that, at least to an extent. It's saying, like, it's not necessarily that we have to throw out or almost do nothing or care very little about the last 3,000 years of Jewish material. It's just that we have to look at it in a new way, and it could be really profound still.
Yeah. And I think that part of the reason that a lot of folks have been like, well, that doesn't speak to me, there might be a few reasons, but one is if you yourself, whoever you are, either because of the fact that you're intermarried or the child of intermarriage, or because you're a person of color, or because you aren't Jewish but you're exploring, or whatever your way in is, if you haven't felt included in those spaces, then you've been either told directly or sometimes made to feel that this isn't for you. And so although there might be stuff that would be relevant to your life, you're like, well, okay, I'm not going to connect with that because that's not for me. And the other thing is, and even as you set it up, and you said, Denise did it formally, wrote about it, and Dan did it informally. Actually, I don't consider myself like a serious Torah scholar. There are other rabbis in the secular humanistic Jewish movement who are way better at Torah than me, especially in terms of the history. What I think is that all of us should get over some of that, like, I'm not qualified enough, I don't know enough Hebrew, I didn't learn this when I was 5, I can't possibly do it now. We are all entitled to it, and we figure out how we make meaning from it on our own. And to me, it's really similar. Before I was a rabbi, I was a literature professor, and I would have the same conversation with like first-year university students, where I would say, look, if you're looking at a text by Shakespeare, sure, there are some people who know the language better, and there are some people who know the history of the Globe Theater better, and there are some people who have studied this much longer than you. But that doesn't mean that you can't read it and get something from it and contribute to a discussion meaningfully about it. So I think that some of this, cultural, the ways in which a lot of Jewish communities have been like, well, you're okay, no, you're not okay, you're in, you're out, that has led to this perception that unless you're like a really good Jew, you don't deserve access. And I really think all of us deserve access, and we need to be much more gentle with each other and be like, if you make a mistake, that's fine. If you have a question, that's great. How do we draw meaning from this, even when we're the bad Jew, or we're just starting, or we're learning?
Yeah, it reminds me of a story that I think I've told before on the Judaism Unbound podcast, but years ago I had a staff, and I was working with a young staff member who had recently had a lot of experiences in the Orthodox world and had a kind of traditionalist mindset about Jewish texts. And we were studying the story in the Torah of when Moses' father-in-law Jethro comes and visits him. And he famously gives this leadership advice that you should kind of have a pyramidal leadership structure where there should be people in charge of 10s and 50s and 100s. And that way Moses isn't responsible for everything all the time. But also in that story, before that whole thing happens, Jethro shows up and he meets Moses and he says, Moses, how are things going? And Moses says, oh, it's been so hard. We've had all these travails and, whatever. And, we got out of Egypt, we were slaves, but then we got out, and the wilderness has been so hard. By the way, all this is extremely relevant to what we're experiencing right now. But
timely.
right. And Jethro says to Moses, basically, like, what are you talking about? Like, you were freed from slavery. It's so great. And he throws a big party, and he invites all the elders and everything. And so when we're studying this text, I said to my staff member, to my team, right, I said, well, I read this part about the party as just as much a critique of Moses's leadership as the part about setting up the pyramidal leadership structure. And that Jethro is saying, like, a good leader has to be getting people up. He can't be a downer. He can't just focus on the negative. He has to focus on the positive, and he should have parties and he should celebrate. And I thought that was sort of made sense to me. And my staff member says to me, which commentator did you get that from? And I said, no, I just read it and that's what I thought. And she said, you can do that. And I said,
right.
I mean, I just did. Like, who's going to stop me?
I
You know,
did it.
it seems
Right now.
reasonable, right? So, like, I'm fascinated about what you say about being a literature professor, because that's actually something that I've been trying to say recently. Particularly, I do some work with camp counselors who are college students, and they're extremely intimidated about Jewish texts and about, you know, interpreting a text, teaching a text. And I'm trying to say to them, but you do this every day in college. You pick up a text that you've never seen before, and you have an opinion about it. So your opinion may be slightly ill-informed, right? I mean, you might pick up a Shakespeare play and read it and think that, you know, some ancient or, you know, older English word means something that turns out it doesn't, and, you know, your idea is kind of wrong. But like, I haven't seen that that's stopping a lot of college students from expressing strongly held views, you know, but somehow it's stopping people from, you know, expressing strongly held Jewish views, and instead they're looking around for some expert to tell them what the right answer is. And I don't know why. Like, I don't know why people have internalized that sense of that disempowerment when it comes to Judaism. And we're talking about smart people, we're talking about educated people. I can understand in a previous time in Jewish history where most Jews were not educated and couldn't
If
even
you're not
read,
literate, you can't
not
read
literate, right?
text, right?
Right. But
Yeah.
now, you know, the vast majority of Jews are I mean, probably the vast majority are literate, and a huge majority are like extremely well educated. And so so why do we come to these texts with such a level of fear or sense of illegitimacy? And I think a lot is lost,
Well, I
because I think
think,
this is really important wisdom.
yeah, yeah, a lot gets lost. I think that I mean, first of all, I just want to do a shout out to folks who are like, no, but I tried to read it and I don't like it. You know, so there's something to be said for people who are like, this is not my way into Judaism. And
Right,
so
right.
while I'm happy to chat about text, it doesn't have to be about text for everybody. But I think some of the anxiety around connecting with text comes from the fact that you know, we treat Jewishly in Jewish culture and religious spaces. I think rightly we treat text with a huge degree of reverence, and so you know you acknowledge your teachers. You know these are holy books for a lot of people, and so in that way it is a little bit different from reading whatever you would be picking up in college, because people aren't praying from those books the same way. Now, obviously there's a range of perspectives on this. When people this is going to be one of those daring things that I'm going to say it and some people might not like it, but here we go, that's why it's daring Judaism. When I see people, you know, dance with the Torah and kiss the Torah, that seems like idolatry to me. I think that's weird. You
Mhm.
know, it's a series of books. I love books, but I don't kiss
Right.
books. You know what I mean?
By the way, I think
And
people like you are at a high advantage in this current time, because nobody should be kissing anything these days.
we should not be kissing. Absolutely. And so I think that, and thank goodness for Safaria that gives us access to a lot of text without having to hold a physical object and share germs. But but I think that's part of why. Like, it's like, how am I supposed to read this book that people are dancing around with and kissing, and like it has to live in a certain special place, and there's all this ceremony around how we even open it, right? So all of that is super intimidating for newbies. And so I really encourage people who might be curious about text. Like, I'll just own the fact that I did not read any biblical text directly as a PhD in literature, where I've read so many things based on Bible, but I didn't
Hmm.
actually read the Bible until I started going to rabbinical school.
Hmm.
Like, why? When would I don't know. That was not part of my orbit. And so I get it why people are like, well, I don't even have a way into this besides going to a synagogue where, you know, Hebrew is required or whatever, you know. So
Right.
there are a lot of barriers. But for those of us who don't see, especially for those of us who don't see the Torah as a sacred, you know, living object that we need to treat with this level of reverence, I say go on Safaria, look up the weekly Torah portion, you know, see what you think, just as you were saying, right?
Yeah.
What lands for you? And it doesn't have to be so scary.
Yeah. And I would also take what you're saying and add one layer to it, which is that we think of the Torah, for example, we've been told to think of the Torah as a text. And of course, it is a text. And it's also stories, meaning you know, there, like, if we think about like Rumpelstiltskin or The Little Mermaid or Hansel and Gretel, um, we don't, those are in a text, right? I mean, those are in the collected works of Hans Christian Andersen. I'm not sure if Rumpelstiltskin is in that, but you know, those are in in a book called The Brothers Grimm, you know, whichever books. There is a text, but we don't think of them generally as a text. We think of them as a story that we know. And so that's another way that I think people get tripped up, because especially because those who really focus on the text part, including me, but I mean, I don't think I do what I'm about to say, but I am a person who loves the text part of it. And I love to read the text itself and think about it and all the nuances. And also, I think that the stories stand on their own. And I think that, like, for example, in this time, I wouldn't want people to be overly intimidated by the stories of our Jewish mythology because they're associating it as a text. And they're afraid of it because it's a text, because then they're not going to access it, even with the encouraging things that we might say. Most people are not going to access it as a text. And yet, I feel like mythology is important in times of crisis, because the
Yeah,
myths
I
that our
agree.
societies remember, right, are the myths that somehow were helpful in difficult times. The way that I talk about wisdom is that wisdom is what you generally learn through the school of hard knocks, but if you learn it through the school of hard knocks, you're probably learning it too late for the challenge that you're facing.
Mm,
And so instead we try to pass them on through the generations so that people will know what to do when the crisis comes right away, even though they've never experienced it in their lifetime. And so that's why, to me, the myth of the wilderness is so powerful right now, because right now, and it's kind of on the nose, like that we have experienced plagues and now we're in the
very
wilderness.
on the nose.
It's totally chaotic. We don't know what to do. And yet we sort of do know what to do, I think, if we look to some of those stories and some of those myths, which I think we can explore a little today, and a little bit on an ongoing basis. But for example, I mean, just to take the one story that I was talking about, Moses's father-in-law. First of all, it's important to know about Moses's father-in-law that he is a Midianite, meaning he's from the wilderness. So when Moses and the Israelites, say, Lex, you're not supposed to be
Hi,
here.
Lex. Lex
um,
under the name of Dan. It's very tricky.
right. So when so you know, the live TV, everybody, that's what happens. So we're just gonna roll with it. So Moses' father-in-law is a man of the wilderness. So when Moses and the Israelites arrive at the wilderness, and he comes and gives his advice, I really hadn't seen it until this week, that he's a man of the wilderness and he knows what to do in the wilderness. So of course he's the one. Generally, it's taught in Jewish context that, like, oh, we got advice from a non-Jew, and isn't that wonderful? You know, we should take advice from non-Jews. Absolutely. And also in this particular case, he's not only a non-Jew, he's a man of the wilderness, and we're new to the wilderness. And so we better look around for who knows what's going on here. And
Yeah.
that seems like extremely vital to me. And actually, I think it's something for the two of us to talk about, because if we're talking about the digital wilderness, then I wouldn't necessarily say that you and I are like, you know, I mean, I'm no Bill Gates, you know, I don't want to speak for you, but we've been out here in the digital world for at least a few years. And so I kind of feel like we
Yeah.
have some thoughts that are probably pretty relevant to, like, a lot of
We're the
these huge
Jethros.
organizations. Yeah, let's talk about that. You know, a lot of these huge organizations that
Yep.
are, right, you know, and it's interesting, like maybe we should show up at the camp and make a few recommendations like Jethro did.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll actually just say that I have been doing that a little bit. People have been asking me, okay, so how do you run a digital Seder? You
Right,
did it last
right.
year. Like, what do we do? So, and I'm happy to help. I
Yeah, we
think
should
that
talk about that, by the way.
let's
That's
talk
on
about
people's
that.
minds.
Totally. Yeah, I just want to come back to the wilderness. So, although I like the metaphor of the digital wilderness, to me, it's really similar to what we were saying about tech. I am no tech genius. I think tech is similar to text in that you don't have to be a genius to be able to do it, right? You got to play with it. You got to get in there and see what's going on, and then eventually things come together. So learning text and learning tech are really parallel in my view. Um, but I have, through Secular Synagogue, been running an online community. And so, just to note one big difference between some of the digital Judaism going on, including this right now, and also what I'm doing with secular synagogue is that it's meant to be really a community. So what you would find if you went to a synagogue space, it's like we actually know each other. We talk to each other. So it's a little bit less like just content delivery and a little bit more building community. And I think some people find that very hard to do in the digital wilderness. But I think, in my experience, is that in some ways it's easier for people to connect that way because if you don't know what the rabbi's talking about, you can just quietly Google it on your own while in real time. If
Mm-hmm.
you are somebody who's sort of shy, then you can really think about what you want to post before you post it. It's less of a live conversation. And same for sure with people, for example, with cognitive processing disabilities. It's so hard to participate in live discussions
Mm-hmm.
because by the time you know what you want to say, things have moved along. But in online spaces, there are plenty of possibilities. So I think in terms of access, certainly in terms of time zones, like, I'm just so excited about people who live all over the world coming together. So
Right.
lots and lots of possibilities in the digital wilderness for making a people, for making a community that are fun to explore. But I don't want to lose sight of the wilderness as actual wilderness
Mm-hmm.
because the cost of all of us connecting by screens, and both you and I think have been on Zoom a lot over the last week or so, it's tiring in a different way. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that Jethro was a person of the wilderness, but also that Moses spent a lot of time as a shepherd before he was able to lead his people. And I think there's wisdom there that we should be, those of us who are healthy and able to leave the house, who aren't in full quarantine, but are able to be socially distant while being outside, we should be getting outside. And one of the things that's been really wonderful for me, obviously I'm not happy we're in this circumstance, but every morning, my partner and my kids and I have been going for a hike, and it's been lovely and definitely serving me as a leader, right? I'm much more grounded because of the time I'm spending in the wilderness. And I think that, the wilderness metaphor has a lot of possible implications.
Uh-huh.
Sorry, I just went on
Uh-huh.
a couple
No,
tangents there.
no, it's great. I mean, but let me ask you this. So, like, let's say that we're talking about, because I don't really have a clear answer to this. I haven't quite been confronted with this opportunity. I would call it an opportunity yet, where some leader of a major Jewish organization has called me up and said, "What do you know about the wilderness?"
Mm,
So that hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will happen. But I'm just thinking, like, what would I say? And I don't mean the kind of cliche, but oh, like mute everybody when they come onto Zoom.
yeah,
Like that. I
you
mean,
can
that's
find those
important.
tips.
Those tips are important, but I mean, sort of more profoundly, like, what if? I mean, let just as an example that you said casually, but I would emphasize it is that because I've been trying to think about this, is that when we're all in the wilderness, think about the time zone thing. Then if we think about it as a location, as like so it's sort of like imagine the internet as one location, and the Jews have all just come there from many different locations. And so you could even think of it as tribes, but now somebody who is in Seattle and somebody who is in New York and somebody who is in Tel Aviv, whose bodies are there,
Mhm.
can literally be in the same place at the same time on the internet, meaning that
Yeah,
we're all, and the opportunity is therefore huge, but the challenge is also huge because it's sort of like you imagine and also in like comedic movies about the Exodus, like there's just all these people milling around, and they just like don't know what to do, and they're running into each other, and they're just like all there. And on the one hand, if you could kind of get them to all experience something positive together, it would be an enormous achievement. And yet the probably more likely situation is they just kind of mill around for a while and start wandering off because they don't know how to live, and nobody knows how to lead them in that situation. So I guess I'm thinking, like, what
how do we
would
do
we
it?
advise?
Well, I mean, not everybody likes to hear my advice, but here's the daring part again. First of all, I do think people need leaders. I think a lot of folks are like, oh, well, in the digital space, it's a little bit of a, Wild West, like everybody can be a leader, which is true in a sense. And there's nothing wrong with, leading your own digital Seder with your family this year, if that's the way you can come together or whatever it is. But I actually think rabbis still have a role to play, or at least if you're not a rabbi, like somebody with training or somebody with knowledge or somebody who knows how to organize, a community organizer, something. People need leaders, and especially now people need leaders because this is a hard time, and it's very difficult to figure out how you avoid just milling around bumping into each other when everybody feels lost, in a personal way. And a lot of people are feeling lost right now. This change was sudden and fast and a lot. Like, I can't remember a time in my life where such profound change has happened so quickly.
Yeah.
Even something profound in my life, like becoming a parent, I had lead time. I knew I was pregnant. There was a period of adjustment where I could get my head around it. But this was not like that. And so I do think people need leaders. I do think leaders deserve to be paid. And I think we need to figure out new models for that. I know that's something you talk about on Judaism Unbound a lot. But for me, I think people need to find their people. I did something every Friday. I do a Shabbat live on my Facebook. So usually for secular synagogue folks, I do it for them. But lately I'm doing it for my whole public Facebook page because I think a lot of people need leadership. And last week, what I talked about was how it feels like now digitally, it's like when you went to high school. Maybe this wasn't your high school experience, Dan, but it was
I'm sure
mine.
it wasn't.
I
had a lot of trauma in high school, but we could talk about that.
Okay. Yeah. So, well, exactly. I think a lot
Okay.
of people did. And so for me, I came from a very, very small, kindergarten to 8th grade school. And then I was in a very huge high school. And I was like, whoa, and how do I find my people here? And I think right now the digital space is like that, right? It's like we came from our little wherever we connect, and now we're online. It's so vast. How do we find our people, right? How do I find my friends? And just like for me in high school, there might be some trial and error. You hang out with these people, no, that doesn't go so well. You tried these people, no, maybe not. These people are mean to you, whatever. But then eventually you find your people, hopefully. And I think the digital space is sort of like a big high school Judaism wilderness experience right now.
Yeah, it's kind of like all of a sudden, I think it's really like how you're describing it, like all these people who came from little private middle schools. And right, because that's sort of all our Jewish organizations. Like there are these little private middle schools, and like I may have been like a really popular kid there, but now I'm in this big high school or college, and like I don't know, maybe I'm not going to be popular anymore. And it may be that
big
like
fish in a small pond to a small fish in a big pond.
Right, and it may be that like I wasn't so popular there, and now all of a sudden the new big high school is like a miracle for me because all of a sudden there are all these people who are like me, and my school didn't have a person like me, and now all of a sudden, so it's interesting that it potentially flips. Who's popular, who's not popular, and I don't mean popular, but who's happy, who's unhappy, right, in that stage. And one of the questions is, can we help the people who may be unhappy in this new stage? Can we help them be happy? Because in a way, the people who are now super happy to be in the digital space, on the one hand, we might say, hey, we want to serve them because they're the ones who are rah-rah and they're excited and ready to go. It may be that in terms of, we're thinking about leadership, that actually our role, or those of us who want to play a leadership role, actually have to worry about the people who are not so happy to be there. And interestingly, for me as somebody who until 2 weeks ago, was kind of running a program that's kind of edgy, that tries to be edgy, that tries to say, hey, we're for the people who are kind of unhappy in the existing Jewish world. Now I almost find it a little bit flipped, because I find in some ways like my people, the Judaism Unbound people, are kind of a little excited to be here now in the digital wilderness. And so, yes, we want to still serve them, of course, and we want to amplify that and everything. And we are. And at the same time, I got a call from somebody who said, my elderly father would really like to participate in a Jewish live, a Torah study class that was going on, but he doesn't have a computer. Can you provide a phone information? And all of a sudden I was like, I want to serve those people who are the opposite kind of people that I was serving 2 weeks ago. Right. And it's really interesting.
It is interesting. I think, and so in addition to secular synagogue, I serve a congregation in Toronto called Arenu Congregation for Humanistic Judaism. And a lot of our members are older, and some of them are super tech savvy and some of them are not. And so I put out, to that community, like, first of all, if you are somebody who's tech savvy, one of the biggest mitzvahs, like a good deeds you could do right now, is helping people connect online, right? Explaining somebody over the phone how you do Zoom or how you connect to Facebook might be actually an incredibly valuable thing right now to make sure people stay connected. And I said to folks, this is an opportunity to learn these new skills. Maybe you were reticent before, but now you have time, and this will be really important for you to stave off loneliness and to foster social connection. Now my people, in terms of who I serve, still remains, people who call themselves secular or cultural Jews, spiritual but not religious, those people. So I know that I'm not the right rabbi for people who want online prayer services, for example, because that's just not what I offer. But I do think that this moment when we're in the digital wilderness is a good time for people to get over some of their, your boundaries, like, no, it has to be like this stream of Judaism or it's not valid or whatever, and learn about what everybody's doing and refer. Sometimes I refer people to the more religious thing or to the more, witchy Kohenet thing or whatever it is, because I know that's what they want. And I also really appreciate when rabbis, I have some Orthodox rabbis who refer people to me because they're like, I'm not serving you the way you need to be served, but here's somebody who maybe could. And now I think is really the time to get over some of our internal divisions and reach out across all the movements and beyond of Judaism and be like, what are you offering? Okay, I now know how I can make sure everybody in this digital space has a place, has a leader, has a community, has a learning opportunity, or whatever they need, right? We need to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why, like, just to clarify, to my mind, Jewish Live and Judaism Unbound are two profoundly different projects. I mean, there are relationships between them. They're both highly digital, right? They're both sort of embrace the digital wilderness and the digital age, but they don't serve the same constituencies. I mean, Jewish Live is meant to serve everybody. Everybody, whereas Judaism Unbound is happy to serve whoever wants to be served by it, but it's kind of designed for people who are really looking for the edge. But Jewish Live is just a different project, and like you say, like I don't know, I could never lead services for anybody, much less somebody traditional. And but what I can do is guide people towards those services, and that's what we're trying to do. And again, it's still chaotic, it's still early, but it's kind of interesting experience. I wanted to shift to something that you brought up earlier, because I think it actually connects to this week's Torah portion in an interesting way, and we want to spend some time on that. And you can also take it elsewhere in terms of the Torah portion. But this week's Torah portion is the first part of Leviticus, Vayikra. And the reason I actually sort of know a little bit about it is because 1 year ago today, Lex and I did a Bimbo Bomb animated video about this portion.
Did you share it? Did you find out? I would love to see it.
Yeah, I mean, share it now, or I don't know.
Can you do it via screen share or no?
Oh, I can. Yeah, like let me. Well, I have to figure out how to. I have to search for it. So maybe next time you're talking, I'll search for it, and then
sounds good. What were you
going to say? We can play it. But what I was going to say was that it's about so it's about bringing all kinds of sacrifices. And sometimes the sacrifices seem extremely alienating to us today, because it's like, what are we like wasting the food for? God, does he really want it? Whatever. And yet I think it's one thing that's important to know about the sacrifices is that that was how the priests were fed. Yeah. So you would make a sacrifice and you would burn it. Sometimes you would burn it up to a crisp and it wouldn't be edible. But a lot of times you would basically cook it. It was like a barbecue. And who was going to eat the barbecue? Not God. The priest would eat the barbecue. And so what's interesting to me about that is that it goes to what you were saying about leaders need to be paid. And I feel like it's weird to shift into this sort of mindset right now and talk about leaders being paid in this wilderness, because it's a wilderness and it's a chaotic, and who knows really who are the leaders today, and are they going to be good leaders and all that. So I kind of feel like we have the old leaders, right, who are the leaders of the institutions that are now scrambling, and they should also still be paid, and a lot of them are trying to figure out how to bring what they do into the digital world, and that's amazing and wonderful, and absolutely, like, those folks should continue to be paid. What I'm asking about is kind of, what about these like new emerging leaders in the digital wilderness? How are they going to be paid? And I think it's not really, and if they're not paid, right, they're not going to be able to do anything. probably, unless they're
Not for
very
long.
wealthy. Yeah, unless they're independently wealthy, which, by the way, like a lot of the early rabbis were independently wealthy, and after the destruction of the
Yeah.
Second Temple, I think that there's something to be said for the capacity of independently wealthy people to lead at a time like this. There are also problematics about it, but if nobody's going to be paid, then realistically it's the people who have another source of income that are going to be able to lead. All that said, what about if those folks are not the best leaders for this time? How do we enable the more scrappy just people to lead? And maybe it's not in the same old way of, maybe it's premature to be offering salaries and pensions and benefits and all
Right.
these kind of things for a situation that we don't know if it's going to last for a month or a year or longer, and we don't even know what's going to be on the other end of it. And yet maybe there's some way to nevertheless make it economically feasible. And I'm wondering, I guess, whether to this week's Torah portion in some way raises thoughts for you about that, and again, whether our mythology helps us a little bit to navigate this question, and also whether there are other things about this week's Torah portion that you want to share.
Sure. So I hadn't thought about it in terms of you got to feed the priest, but that's real. And I think, I'm not, one of the tricky things about reading it that way is that people are making offerings often when they've done something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to benefit from the bad things other people are doing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As a leader. So I don't want it to be like, all right, like I hit someone, so here I'm going to make a donation to my synagogue to make up for it, because I don't think that actually makes up for it. The Torah portion does go into that. So that's kind of neat, which I'll talk about in a second. But just on the question of new models for paying leaders, and again, leaders could be rabbis, leaders could be community organizers, leaders could be anybody who's taking leadership seriously. I'll just share, like in the daring spirit of vulnerability, so far with Secular Synagogue, I put all the money back into it. So I'm not really being paid, and I'm able to do it because I do draw salaries from my university and from my Toronto congregation. And I think that's real for a lot of people. It takes money to, or at least some other way of sustaining yourself, to really do a startup, because for me, it was really important to stay independent. So I didn't seek money from any external source because I didn't want a lot of rules attached to what I was doing. I wanted it to be co-created. Not everybody's in a position to do that, obviously. But the way we do it is it's a monthly membership fee. It's sort of comparable to Netflix, right? And I think more and more places will go that route. I think that there's awesome opportunities like Haggadot.com, which really shout out to them, because what they're doing is incredible. So that's a website where you can go and create your own Haggadah based on all of these clips people have put up, or see a bunch of Haggadot that are already pre-written if you want to just borrow one of those for your Seder. What a gift this year, especially because, so many people are figuring out, like I'm not going to my grandmother's house where she has the set of Haggadot. So like, what am I going to do?
Right.
And they're really trying to be inclusive, and they're awesome. Anyway, all that to say, they have an option to leave a donation. If you're using their site, please donate, right? That's what Judaism Unbound does too. And I think that's a model that can work. We don't need to all have salaries with benefits. But I do think that one of the challenges, especially in Jewish life, is that we got a little bit used to the birthright model, where we think Judaism should be free. And it's hard to get out of that mindset. Obviously, I also want to say that a lot of people right now are facing layoffs and, not working in their usual service industry jobs or whatever. So if you're, finding money challenging right now, this isn't directed to you, but if you're somebody who can afford to pay for the content you're accessing, I think you should consider doing so, because that's how we do get people trying new things and experimenting, and that's how we do grow new leaders. So that's what I'll say about that. About the offerings in the Torah portion, I do think some of the wisdom there is it gets us to think about our own morality in terms of, so the Torah makes a distinction between offerings we might make when we do something wrong and harm someone, but it's unintentional, and when we do something wrong on purpose and hurt someone. And those are the things that we can draw, I think, from a Torah portion like this. So to use a very current example with social distancing, I am really finding it hard to stay chill when I see people out there, not caring about social distancing. Because the stakes are very high, and it bothers me. So I'm trying to keep chill. But to me, that's an example that we can look to Torah to be like, look, if you are unknowingly sick and you could kill people out there by, flouting these rules, to me, that's a very different thing than, for example, if somebody 3 weeks ago was unknowingly sick and we didn't have these restrictions in place and they unknowingly infected somebody, it's still catastrophic.
Right.
But the morality piece is different, right? And this is an opportunity, I think, for all of us in these hard times to think about, who do we want to be? Do you want to be the person who puts your self-interest above community wellness? Or do you want to be the person who is the helper, trying to, first of all, not make others sick, but also reaching out to people who don't know how to use Facebook and Zoom and all those kinds of things, helping food banks get together in new ways to provide meals when they can't do it the way they were normally doing it. There are lots of opportunities right now to figure out who you are in a crisis. And the Torah does offer us some wisdom around some of that. The last thing I'll say is, because Vayikra is the very first Torah portion of Leviticus, so we're in a new book. And earlier you were talking about the power of story and mythology. And that's very real. I really believe that. Here's a daring thing to say. I don't believe the stories are true. I don't believe the Exodus actually literally happened, certainly not the way it's told in the book of Exodus. So it does maybe prompt us to think about, so why are these stories here? Why did people, I believe they're written by people for people. So why did people feel these stories were essential? And a story like Exodus, particularly that we tell every year through the ritual of the Passover Seder, is a story that creates and keeps a people. It's a shared narrative that tells us something about who we are and how we're supposed to behave. I think it's extremely powerful. But I do think often when people get into reading text for the first time, they come from Genesis. It's like the creation of the world and like amazing storytelling about the binding of Isaac and Jacob and Esau and all these awesome, so the flood, amazing. Then we're in Exodus and we have Moses and plagues and it's such great storytelling. And then we're in Leviticus. And the tone shifts. It's much more legalistic. It's much more about rules. The narrative is way less fun. And so I know people who might be interested in starting now might be reading this text and be like, what? Right? So I challenge you to look for the story behind the story, right? Why all these offerings?
Right.
What is the text trying to get people to do? Why was it needed at this time? And where can we find the narrative when it's less of an obvious mythology and more of a text that seems maybe really concerned about rules, and there's a lot of stuff in there about cleaning. It's not always great storytelling in Leviticus, but there's still a story there. So the challenge is to search for it.
I couldn't have said that better. I totally agree with that. So maybe I did dig up my Bimbo Bomb video, and I think it connects to your setup. So why don't we share that? It's about 3.5 minutes, and then we can discuss it. So let's see. I've never shared my screen on live TV before, but here we go.
Oh no, just pause it, Dan. I don't think we can hear it.
Oh, okay. Well, so then maybe it's sad. Yeah, we're gonna have to figure it. There's probably a way to do it, but we don't know. We don't know what the way is.
Here we are in the wilderness.
Right. We'll share it later in the week, or next week. But I mean, there are various elements to it that are actually. Maybe I should do a voiceover, but I don't really feel like talking for.
I think that'd be amazing. No pressure.
It is good animation. Actually, maybe we can do let's share it and let's just us do a voiceover. It's at least sort of interesting.
I don't know if I'll know it well enough.
No, we don't have to do a voiceover to describe it, but I'm just saying at least we have something more interesting for the viewers to watch as we as we talk about it.
Totally.
But
See, there's the
but
barbecue.
right. But
This is
basically,
so good.
they're great. I mean, and by the way, I mean, something like to talk about it, and that a few people have written about recently, is that Bim Bomb, the organization that made these videos, they closed about just about not too long after this came out. And
Yeah,
you know, it's because they weren't able to raise enough money. And you know,
right.
what's and then a number of people have written like, what a shame that Bim Bam isn't around just when we need them. You know, and wouldn't it
Yeah.
have been important to have an organization that was expert at digital video for kids, you know, or however you want to, you know, at this time. And obviously that's true. And so a leadership question for maybe the next era after the coronavirus distancing period is, how do we be a little better at helping fund future oriented work that may seem not so essential right now, but that maybe we could do a little bit of futurism and imagine that either the world is changing, because clearly the world is going more and more digital. So an organization like Bim Bam
Yeah,
is obviously ahead of their time. And I don't think a
exactly.
whole lot of people calculated that there was going to be some kind of plague, and that all of a sudden we would be, you know, only living in the digital wilderness for many, many months. But but maybe, but maybe futurists were thinking that, you know, and I know they were in the
Mm,
government, because there are all kinds of, you know, game plans about things, including a pandemic. And one of the things that I said the other day is I feel a little bit of betrayal that the government sort of knew that this was a possibility, and I had never heard of it before. And
right.
so it just feels like maybe we have to build sort of futurism into some Jewish planning in a way that's better than we have, because it's a real shame that Bim Bam isn't around.
It is a shame. And I agree. I think there's been a lot of talk during this very strange period of COVID-19 where people keep saying, like, you know, do we want to just go back to normal, or do we want to create a new normal? Are
Mm-hmm.
there lessons from this time? And
Mm-hmm.
one of the lessons, surely, is that we can connect to each other online in all kinds of awesome ways. Uh, the question of payment, and also just like how do we sustain organizations like Bim Bam? Because I think sadly one of the realities is, once there was already a video for each Torah portion, there was a kind of like, well, why should we keep supporting
Yeah.
you?
Right.
And I think there's I was having this discussion just a few weeks ago. One of the last things I did before social distancing was attend the Knisa gathering, which brings together people who are doing really interesting work in the Jewish community that's non-traditional. We come together and share ideas. And we had a really engaged conversation in one of the groups I was in about a sense of obligation, because we're not in a cultural moment right now. I'm not just talking about Jewish culture, but just generally, especially in North America, where we're big into obligation. We don't like the idea of feeling obliged.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the realities of what has sustained synagogues is a sense of obligation, that like you're obliged to pay for it, you're obliged to show up, you're obliged to help out on committees. There was a deeply entrenched sense of obligation, and it's how things ran. And not only did that keep the lights on, but it also did provide people with a sense of spiritual satisfaction, because it turns out when you're in a community that feels obligated to each other, you are in a caring community. People will show up for you if you're sick. People will
Mm-hmm.
want to help you out. People know
Mm-hmm.
you.
Yep.
And I think that I've been really playing with that idea of obligation now. It's unsexy for sure, but you know, what's our obligation to Bim Bam? What's our obligation to the people who are creating stuff? If our mentality is just like, we'll take whatever we can get and we don't have to offer anything in return, stuff can't be sustained that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to just be money, but can it be volunteer time? Can it be reaching out to others to help connect them, or whatever it is? But I'm really thinking about that idea of obligation and how it's connected with spirituality
Yeah.
more broadly, and especially now.
Yeah. As I was watching the video, I was there was a part actually when I watched it with my wife last night, because our cantor from our synagogue that we're members of asked me to send it so that they could share it during services tomorrow. Now I have to remind her that we have to figure out how to work the audio, but but so we watched it last night, and there's this part at the end. I don't know if you noticed the part where like the earth is getting kind of full of all this like stuff, and there was that what was going on there was that the Leviticus Torah portion talks about the specific sin offerings that the leader is meant to bring when the leader has messed up. And what's interesting is that clearly in this coronavirus situation, not necessarily pointing fingers at particular leaders in particular countries in particular times, but clearly there have been areas where leaders could have done a better job and still could do a better job. And in a way, the image in the video is very apt. I mean, this idea that when the leader does a bad job, like the earth starts, the earth pays the price, or we pay the price, and that the leader needs to apologize when the leader makes a mistake. Now, we know that certain leaders in our world today do not like to apologize ever for any reason, which seems to be just on an ethical level a horrible, right? It just seems like a very basic ethical principle that people should apologize sometimes, and the idea that you would never apologize. Right, and the idea that a person would say, "I never apologize," seems to be just by definition, an ethical breach. But I was also thinking about Bimbo Bomb as we were talking about like those leadership failures, because I feel like in a way we collectively as a community owe Bimbo Bomb an apology, because we weren't there to support them in the amazing work that they were doing sufficiently. Obviously, it wasn't sufficient to allow them to keep doing their work and to keep existing. And like, so it's not enough to just write articles about how it's too bad, we didn't preserve Bim Bomb when we needed it. It actually, I think, would be beneficial to apologize. And I want to offer my apology because, I feel like it's not like I specifically didn't, like I didn't have any money to give them, but I mean, I think it's our collective, and I think we all owe Bim Bomb an apology because we needed them now, and we didn't love them enough when they needed that love, and so now they're not here for us. And I'm sorry that that's true, and I'm sorry for my piece of the contribution to it. And I wish I could bring an offering.
Beautifully said. Yeah. Well, I echo that absolutely. And then it's a very important Jewish principle when you apologize, particularly when you think about, around the high holidays when we do tshuvas. It's not enough to just say sorry. It's about changing behavior moving forward, right? When I was saying before, this is an opportunity to figure out who we want to be. A lot of people are like, I have to support small businesses more. I have to. We have to change the way we do business here. I think there are a lot of wake-up calls, and this could be part of that.
Right. And actually, I want to reinforce something that you said earlier, because it was really super important about the small gifts. Right, because in the pre-corona Jewish world, you were talking about birthright. There was a right in the pre-corona Jewish world, there was this federation system, and the way that the federation system worked and works to some extent still is that a lot of people give small amounts, and then this big entity, the federation, now has a big amount, and then they allocate it out to in various ways that they deem sort of appropriate. That's model one. To some extent, a lot of that was replaced by model two, which is that extremely large, wealthy foundations have a lot of money. They don't need to collect it from all the people that are giving to the campaign. They already have it, and they give it out in large amounts to organizations. The question is whether either of those models makes it into in the wilderness. And the other possibility that I think digital technology now enables is essentially to cut out the middleman, to say that regular people can just give small amounts. This is the Bernie Sanders campaign. This is right, the idea that the Elizabeth Warren campaign, the idea that you don't need to have PAC money, right, because you can get enough money from building a movement of small dollar donors. Now, the question is, the building a movement part is the hard part, because I can tell you from 4 years of experience with a essentially tip jar on Judaism Unbound that it's wonderful and it helps us, a bit, but it's not, it's a fraction of what our operating costs are. And I've always sort of had this hopeful sense that like when the technology is a little less friction, like when it can just be that if you're listening to this now in the Apple Podcast app, just hit donate right now and you'll donate $1 and you don't even have to do anything, people will, because I sort of believe that people have the generosity they want to give. They just, don't necessarily want to go through the 3 screens and put in their credit card number and all that kind of thing. So I don't know. But I think that this is going to be an interesting test of that, because I think that, and again, back to our mythology, right? I mean, both good and bad, although, right, I and Amichai Levi aren't as sure that this is bad, but the golden calf was created with small dollar donations. And the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was also created with small dollar donations, that the Torah talks about how everybody should bring their earrings and their, small things. And it wasn't some like big funder for the tabernacle. And so again, I go back to the mythology. I want to really say, like, I think our mythology tells us what to do. And our mythology tells us that in the wilderness, you don't have big funders, you have small dollar donations. Now, I say that also admitting that I'm currently in the process of trying to get some big funders to give money to Jewish Live. And I hope that if they're listening, they understand that I'm not saying that I don't love them and I don't need their funds, and I do. And yet I think that probably the world in which that we need to sort of build towards pretty quickly is a world that's more like the way that you were describing it, in the way that I think our mythology describes it.
Yeah, I think it can be a mix, right? Like you and I often both talk about doing digital stuff doesn't have to replace, real life stuff or like in-person stuff. It does right now, but not always. So I think often people feel threatened. It's like, there's going to be no more federations. Like what? It's like they can still be there, and you can make a little donation on a website sometime. Like it's fine. There's a lot of room out here. Can I do a little plug for the Secular Synagogue Digital Seder, because it's tomorrow? So
yes.
Okay, so the Secular Synagogue is a community, as I mentioned, that meets online and always has. And last year they said to me, it was actually, I talked about it on Judaism Unbound when I was on your show, that people in the community were like, we should have a digital Seder. And I was like, yes, we should. How do we do that? And so we figured it out, and it was so meaningful and beautiful. And even before all this stuff happened, we always planned to do it before Passover, because people often get busy with their family ones, and also because I put out the replay for folks. So if they want to follow along to something with their own family Seder, then they have that. And then they have our Secular Synagogue Haggadah that we co-create through haggadot.com. So our Seder's tomorrow, and it is for people who are part of the community. So I'll just say it isn't free, but you can just pay for the month, which is $22, and then you can quit anytime. So it's like a very Netflixy model, and it would be an amazing time to join us. So if you want in, today would be a great day to join, to make sure you get into the group and everything before the Seder tomorrow. And I'm
how
really
do you do that?
Next week, you and I get to talk about how the digital Seder went.
So next week I want to talk about how the digital Seder went, and I want to like give tips for how to run your own digital Seder for people, because I think people are like desperate and hungry for that. And I wish that we should have planned a little better and taken some time to do that today. But I think
it'll be before Passover.
Yeah, it'll be before Passover. Can you just tell us before we go, like, so how does somebody do this, Netflixy join Secular Synagogue?
Okay, do you want me to screen share for a quick second?
Sure.
I can show. So can you see my screen okay? Oh, that's the Zoom screen. Okay. Oh, I had this up too. People want to look at my book. We'll talk about that in a future week. But this is our digital Seder graphic, and they just go to secularsynagogue.com. I've got a Passover prep checklist here, some other stuff. And then if you hit learn more and sign up, then all of the information is right there. It should be pretty easy.
Amazing. So I mean, I think like what I love about like what you just said earlier too is that you can join and then quit, right? Meaning that that I don't encourage that, but the point is that you should explore these days. And I think for $22, it seems to me like it's not a lot to give this thing a shot and probably learn some tips to bring to your Seder in a week. So
that's what I think. Like as we're saying, it's if you can afford it, then I think it's really neat to be able to play in that way. And we have time now. We are at home.
Yeah. Makes me wish that I had thought to put some $22 thing on the Jewish Life page, but you can also go to the Jewish Life/donate and jewishlife.org/donate, and we'll take your $22 also. No, but in all seriousness, I really, it sounds to me like, right, I was going to ask you sort of like, why aren't you doing the Seder on actual, like the official night of Passover? And I'm sure there's all kinds of reasons, including probably you want to have your own Seder, but but the but I think it's awesome that you're not actually, as it turns out, because I think that for, the low price of $22, I think people can kind of check out some examples of how to actually run a digital Seder in a compelling way that hopefully they'll be able to bring to their Seder. So I think that's actually really awesome.
Thanks.
So Denise, I think we've come to the end of our hour, but this was great, and I really enjoyed doing this. And we're going to do this every week at the same time. And we would love to take any feedback from anybody who's been watching. I'm looking at Facebook and other tools that we have here, and there are people watching,
Great.
which is great since we didn't really even advertise this episode, but we will advertise next week's episode. So we expect to have more people. And so anybody who has been watching today, please, give us your tips and thoughts, and we're excited to keep this going.
Great. Thanks, Dan. It was so much fun.
Yeah, thank you. We'll talk to you soon.